right. Welcome back to the Summer of Protocols Town Hall, a periodic guest talk series focused on protocols and protocol research. In today's research guest talk, we will be talking with Nils and Jonathan from the Berggruen Institute about planetary protocols. I'll post a link in the chat here for the link to the forum where we'll host any questions or comments or conversation around this guest talk. Next guest talk will be in 1 week, March 27th, with Trent Van Epps. And you can find more about the Summer of Protocols, the program calendar, protocol kits, previous research, and the 2024 call for applications on summerofprotocols.com. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass it off to Venkat to introduce our speakers today.
All right. So welcome to the talk. And for those of you who are just joining because we announced the application process and did that town hall, this is actually a great talk for you guys to dive into the world of protocols, because this is about the most ambitious scale at which you can think protocols. So if you want to think big, this is kind of your cue to do that. And obviously, in the world of blockchain protocols in particular, there's a lot of interest in things like, network states and new ways of like building institutions and global coordination mechanisms using technology means. So I thought it would be really valuable to have Nils and Jonathan come in and talk about their book, Children of a Modest Star. Both of them come from kind of a more traditional policy perspective. And it's a nice foil to some of the sometimes utopian, idealistic ways we tend to think about it as technologists, to like, juxtapose that with a more realistic, realist viewpoint grounded in like history. So this is a book that they'll be talking about, like, how do we actually, if you want to change the world, what does it mean to actually change the world, and how do you go about it? And some background on the speakers. I met Nils almost a decade ago at this point at a meeting in Salesforce, I believe. We were introduced by some mutual friends. And later, when Nils was starting to run the research program at Berggruen, he invited me to apply, and I was a fellow there for a year. Really fun year, researching my favorite topic of time. I'm still working on the book that I was developing there. And Berggruen itself is, so this book, Jonathan is also from Berggruen, and Berggruen is a very interesting think tank that I think you call yourselves a think-do tank, right? Trying to both be a think tank and do stuff, and lots of interesting teams and projects, many of them aligned with what we do here at the Summer of Protocols. They have like a major prize that's kind of like the Nobel Prize of Philosophy. And they just announced a major essay contest on actually themes that are very relevant or very related to today's talk. Planetary is the theme, I think. So if you are an essay writer and you want to write a powerful essay on thinking planet scale and win a $25,000 prize, you should apply to the Berggruen Essay Prize. But with that, I'll hand it over to Jonathan and Nils to talk about Planetary.
Great, John. I'm gonna do share screen, and I will run the deck from my. Okay, can people see the title? Yes, Venkat?
Yes.
Okay, great. So John and so this book that we're publishing, which has the same title as the presentation that you have here, we started thinking about this book really in the fall of 2020. And in many ways, it's a pandemic book. Because the thing that we were struck by, John and I were struck by as we started talking about whether we wanted to write this book together, was obviously in the course of 2020, there was a signal failure to deal with one of the most heavily predicted catastrophic events of all time. For those of you who've been interested in doing scenario planning or have worked on issues of future anticipations of various sorts, literally the most game planned thing ever was for the prospect of a pandemic. These are things that are recurrent throughout human history. We knew it was coming. We didn't know exactly what form it would take. There have been plenty of sort of near calls, false calls, SARS, MERS in the previous decade. And then obviously in 2020 it arrived, and it turned out that despite the fact that there'd been all this, planning effort, basically the response was ineffective. And the question we wanted to ask was why? And why is it also that other kinds of clearly global problems, or what we now are calling planetary problems, such as climate change, are just simply not being dealt with? Everybody's aware of the problem, and it's not that nothing is being done, but nothing effective is being done to deal with these kinds of challenges. And what we sought to do is try to both do a diagnosis of the nature of these problems and how the vocabulary of globalization that had been originally developed sort of in the course of the 1990s and aughts was not necessarily useful or effective for describing these problems. And then also in what was, I think, at least I'll speak for myself and not for John, but what was a much less comfortable process of actually trying to say, what can we actually do about it? Why are the institutions failing, and what kind of institutions might we try to imagine that might be able to be more effective? So we'll run through that today. So first of all, the title of the book comes from a long poem that my favorite poet, W.H. Auden, wrote back in 1940. And I won't read this out loud. I find people who read slides to be an annoying feature. But what I will say is that this poem itself is really interesting. For those of you who are interested in poetry, I recommend it. It's called The New Year's Letter that he wrote to a friend of his. And it's a very long poem. It's about, 1,700, 1,800 lines or something like that. And it's actually divided into 3 sections that kind of mirror the sections of our book. The first section of the poem is reflecting on the nature of the world and the challenges of governance in 1940. Obviously, we now know in retrospect that World War II had already begun, although that was not yet totally apparent for people sitting in Hiroshima or New York City or Stalingrad quite yet. But obviously the world was in a kind of geopolitical crisis. So that's section 1. Section 2 of the poem is really thinking about sort of science and the latest innovations in science and technology, and how that is changing our conception of the world. And actually, this section comes from that middle section of this passage comes from that middle section of the poem. And then the last section of the poem is trying to anticipate where things might be going, and how do we try to imagine things differently. And one of the things that's interesting about this particular couplet, I think, is that it's kind of an ambivalent line, how hard it is to stretch imagination to live according to our station. On the one hand, that line might be taken to be a call for modesty. We recognize increasingly that we are, human beings are but one element of a vastly complicated system of systems of biogeochemical interaction, right? And we recognize that, we don't actually have mastery and control of the planet, and that we are, beholden to things like the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the hydrosphere, the lithosphere, the cryosphere. All of these are elements that are we're dynamically interacting with and disrupting in some ways, but these are forces that are much larger than anything that we even had an idea about until quite recently. But you can also read this passage in an almost opposite way, as a kind of a bold call to action, and that we have to stretch our imagination to try to imagine what it would be like to live in accordance with the scientific principles that we're increasingly using to understand the world. And so that call to action is, I think, really what sparked me and John to write this book. The system as a whole works. One has to understand it and comprehend it in holistic terms. And so we spend some time talking about that as not just a set of scientific events, but also really as a philosophical event, in that it really changes the way in which we think about our place on the planet itself. So one way to understand the planetary is in contradistinction to another term that I mentioned earlier, globalization. Obviously, we're all aware that we live on a planet, we live on a globe, but the concept of globalization, which really, it was basically a term that I think I looked it up once. It was first coined in the late 1960s, and then it sort of appears along in dusty academic journals in the 70s and 80s, but really takes off and explodes as a kind of concept that becomes popular in the 1990s to describe the kind of post-Cold War world. And what the global refers to in the sense of globalization is the flows of human-related things. So things like money, things like people, things like ideas, things like goods and services. Also maybe bads, right? We can also talk about the globalization of crime or of gangsters, of drug flows, of arms, and so on. But it specifically refers to the flows of things that humans are intentionally moving around the planet. The planetary, by contrast, refers to the flows of things around the planet. They're sort of byproducts and unintentional effluvia, quite literally in many cases, of the processes of globalization. And these are things that, unlike the global, which is very attentive to the importance of borders, often trying to engage in arbitrage of price or regulation between different parts of the globe, and obviously price and regulation are very human-centered things. Planetary phenomena, in the terms that John and I are using it here, refers to things that don't care about borders really at all. So emissions, tailpipe emissions, or emissions that come out of a factory, an electricity generation plant, those happen in a particular place. But as soon as the carbon ends up in the atmosphere, it goes global. It goes global, and the effects it's going to have are not localized to anywhere in a particular place. Likewise, the viruses, the virus that affected us, the SARS and the MERS, and obviously the COVID-19 virus. There were many efforts to try to shut borders in order to contain that, and almost all of those eventually failed, including the most draconian efforts that were done in China. Eventually, they gave up about a year ago and succumbed to the pandemic like everybody else. And so we've then developed this idea that there are these categories of planetary things that are flowing around the globe that are not global, but are rather because they're not focused on the human, but they're extra human in nature. So in addition to viruses and carbon, we could talk about things like oceanic plastics or space junk or biodiversity loss. These are all things that are being disrupted by human activity unintentionally in most cases, but that flow outside of the border-based systems of the nation state. As I said earlier, these ideas come out of two basic elements. One I'll focus on here is on Earth system science. And this is, this is a chart many of you have probably seen that tries to describe the relationship between the various physical climate systems, biogeochemical systems, and human activities, and tries to show the flow chart of the various ways in which they are interconnected. And these are all elements. The planetary refers to all the things that are blue and orange, and the red refers to the things on this chart of the ways in which humans are intersecting with these things to disrupt these dynamics. And Earth system science is really focused on how do we describe at various levels of abstraction and at various scales the ways in which these things are all interconnected. But the key point is that it's a holistic view of the entire process. And even though you may try to assess a particular subsystem in the way in which that's happening, it's always done in view of the larger embeddedness in all of these global systems. Now, we refer to this, finally, in philosophical terms, as not just being about a new set of scientific methods for understanding these things, but really a philosophical event in a really important way. And we refer to this as the third decentering. The first decentering, by the way, this is obviously done in terms of Western scientific discourse, but if you go back 500 years, in fact, I think the 500th anniversary of Copernicus's work is coming right up, although he published posthumously a few decades later. The conventional wisdom, scientific wisdom of the day was that we were the planets and the stars all revolved around the sun. And Copernicus proposed instead the famous heliocentric system. And the reason why he waited to publish until he was dead was because this was considered a radical affront to the human-centered and therefore God-centered world. His follower Galileo was brought up by the Inquisition nearly a century later. So this remained a great affront. But of course, we now know that the realities of Copernicus's discoveries mean that the humans are not the center of the world, and indeed the Earth is not the center of the universe. A couple of hundred years later, an equally momentous thing happened, which was initially a scientific discovery that became an important philosophical event, and that was the Darwinian revolution. Darwin famously, he was not the discoverer of evolution, but he was the person who suggested that it happened through through natural selection. And again, it was considered a philosophical event, not just a scientific discovery, because it fundamentally contradicted the view that God had created all the creatures on the earth, and that God had intended the creation of all of these things. Darwin instead said, based on the recent discovery of deep time, that in fact, over millions and even billions of years, all the things that we saw on the earth were ultimately likely, this was a hypothesis that Darwin proposed at the time, which has now been largely corroborated, were part of a single family tree of life. And that this was not a matter of God's direction. The reason why we have the diversities we have happen as a pure matter of random process over deep time. The Planetary, we argue, is a similar decentering and similar kind of philosophical event, because what it suggests is that human beings are not the measures and masters of all things. In fact, we are just part of the biogeochemical process of the planet, and one small, and I wouldn't say trivial, because obviously the anthropogenic forcings that are happening all over the world are really important and creating all sorts of challenges to the habitability of the earth, and we'll get back to that term in a moment, habitability. But it is a fundamental reordering and rethinking of the way in which human beings are on the earth. We no longer are the masters of the planet, but need to understand how we can live in a more commensalist way with the planet. So with that, let me turn it now over to John to think about this in more conceptual and governance terms. John.
All right, thanks. So the impetus, as we kind of mentioned in the beginning, was that the reason we're thinking about this now is because of the pandemic, because of climate change, and that really, what we might summarize as a planet in crisis. So this is a photograph that I know that Nils took from outside of his home in San Francisco on the infamous Orange Day in September 2020, where due to all these wildfires and smoke in the atmosphere, just turned the sky in the Bay Area this insane color. And so like we said, the impetus is trying to understand and have a new language to both accurately describe this condition in which we find ourselves, and then give us a new set of vocabulary, but also tools to be able to do something about it. So next slide. So the principles that we derive from the discussion of entanglement that Nils showed before with the Bretherton diagram and this discussion of kind of the interconnection of all of these systems and this idea of a system of systems, that human beings are embedded entirely and inextricably from the broader biosphere, and that our ability to flourish as one species involves and is predicated on the flourishing of the whole. So again, this holistic vision that comes out of Earth system sciences and other kind of Western sciences return to the idea of holism and whole systems. That in order, again, so the bedrock for our politics needs to shift away from this kind of really anthropocentric vision that we've had now in the West for a number of centuries, to a deeper and more embedded understanding of multi-species flourishing. Next, the multi-species systems that we live in. So next slide. Which then leads us to this kind of lodestar goal that we talk about in the book, which again Nils referenced before, the idea of habitability. And we draw this in distinction to the idea of sustainability. That's kind of the more prominent term in the vocabulary of everyday life, and especially of global governance through the global sustainability goals, or sustainable development goals, excuse me, that the UN has glommed onto, I think, in 2015. Sustainability is this, again, really embedded in this human view of the world, that sustainability means that we want systems to survive so that we can draw on them sustainably, but without really caring about the ultimate ends of these non-human systems themselves, which would include both living systems in the biosphere, but also non-living systems of the Earth system as well. Whereas habitability takes takes a step back, decenters the human, and thinks more about maintaining the planet as habitable, not just for human beings, but for all species. And again, it comes out of this interconnection and embeddedness. Next slide. So another principle or kind of thing that the planetary as a concept brings forward is not just these interconnections, not just entanglement, but just a broader sense of deep history and deep space, or sorry, deep distances, vast distances. So when we're thinking about the planetary as opposed to the global, they both kind of have a similar geographic scale. They're talking about the planet itself. So when we're talking about globalization, we're talking about connecting every part of the Earth through these flows of capital and people and ideas. But it lacks the sense of time. Planetary systems, planetary flows and cycles like the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, phosphorus, etc., biodiversity take place over the course of, in some cases, billions of years, right? That we have this biodiverse planet because of processes that took place over, just immense amounts of time. And that every time we kill off a species, that it goes extinct, we're wiping off the work of billions of years. Whereas again, when we're thinking about the global, this sense of scale isn't there. So reframing the question in terms away from this human-centric vision of the globe and towards this broader sense of the planet puts us on a different way of thinking. Next slide. And this, by ignoring this work, or ignoring, these entanglements and these sense of scale, we end up in these set of crises that, I don't really need to say much about. We're all very well aware of them. So when we skip to the next slide. And this brings us back to a richer discussion of the condition of planetary that Nils mentioned earlier. I'll go through this quickly because I want to make sure we have time to get to the governance stuff in a minute. But basically, we're talking about things that have to do with the flourishing of life on Earth, that are connected to the long history of life on this Earth, have these immense time scales, immense geographies, and that have some sense of human involvement. So when we're talking about planetarity and how it's governed, we're not really talking about things like volcanoes, even though they, affect flourishing of life on Earth and are, deeply entangled over long time scales. That's not really what we're talking about, because there's not really a point of human intervention. So this still remains, in some sense, human-centered, because we're interested in governance, which has to be a human-led thing because of our ability to disrupt things. Which leads us then to what makes a governance challenge, which is specifically that these issues, these planetary issues, are not international, they're not global, they're not about flows happening between nations, they're not bounded by borders, but they're ultimately relate to the planet itself and the relationship between human life and our planetary home. And then finally, that the consequences of these things, even though we're talking so far largely at this vast scale of the planet itself, have very different consequences in different places, which is an issue we'll get to in a second. Next slide. All right, let's skip that. We could skip this. We mentioned this. And then the final concept that we need to talk about, that's part of our understanding, and which I think really relates to this group here, is the idea of planetary sapience, which we take to be basically our growing technologically mediated understanding of the planet, and the relationship between knowing and kind of our condition, that we're only able to know all the things we said before because of this vast technological infrastructure of satellites, which are kind of shown here, sensor networks, and then the hardware and software on supercomputers that it's able to make sense of it. This immense amount of data that lets us understand how complex these systems are. And for us, further developing Planetary Sapiens, pushing ourselves further down this path of knowledge and understanding is a key to being able to govern it. So over to you, Nils. It's your slides then.
Sorry. So John just set up basically what the problem space is, that we have these planetary scale disruptions that are taking place. And as John mentioned, these are not things that are designed, the existing governance institutions we have were fundamentally not set up to deal with these kinds of things. And we therefore need a different set of protocols, if you will, from the point of view of the language of this group, in order to think about how do we actually manage to address these challenges. As you can tell, a lot of this conversation has to do with scale. And one of the basic principles that we have in this, that we propose normatively in our book, is that we need to develop an intentional multi-scalar governance architecture. We already have such a multi-scalar architecture already. We have municipalities, we have, to talk about it from the point of the United States, you have municipalities, you have counties, you have states, you have the federal government, and then obviously you have the international system that's been built up on top of that. But this stuff was basically designed to deal with national scale problems or subnational problems, and was not meant to deal with these kinds of planetary challenges, and therefore are simply not fit for purpose for dealing with these things. So we propose instead a fundamentally different kind of architecture for thinking about global governance. And we call this planetary governance, as opposed to a couple of previous ideas. So the first thing we want to say is that what we're proposing is explicitly not a world state. The idea of a world state or a world federal government was in fact a popular idea in the middle of the 20th century. In the aftermath of World War II, there were active proposals to create a world federal state, and there still in fact is a world federalist movement. This was proposed by people as prominent as Wendell Willkie, who was the Republican candidate for the presidency in 1944 against FDR, who lost. But this was not a crazy idea at the time. There were a lot of people, ranging from Einstein to Winston Churchill to Martin Luther King to Gandhi to Wendell Willkie, and even FDR for a moment flirted with the idea that we should create actually a world state. We could get into a long discussion about why that idea failed at the time, but I think the main point for us normatively right now is that John and I are not in favor of this idea. And there's a bunch of different reasons for that, but just briefly, one of the reasons I'm against it is that I think the possibilities of creating a kind of massively totalitarian state at a global level would be a real serious risk if you had a single unified world state. And that's not something that either John and I are particularly in favor of proposing. But the planetary governance is also not equal to the system of global governance that we have today, which is basically the multilateral system centered on the United Nations. What we have today is a series of nation states. There are currently 193 members of the United Nations, along with a couple of observer states, like the Palestinians, who basically collaborate and coordinate through the multilateral member state institutional system. The United Nations itself, the General Assembly, and the Security Council are probably the most well-known portions of this, but there's a whole alphabet soup of different kinds of agencies, and I'll point out one or two right now as just examples of the way these things work. So the World Health Organization is kind of meant to be a coordination mechanism between states, but as we saw during the pandemic, the World Health Organization turned out to be totally ineffective at actually managing the problems. It could declare that there was a pandemic, and that was supposed, but it couldn't actually do anything to do about it. All it could do was say, it's a pandemic, now each individual nation state, go implement your pandemic plans. It didn't work. Likewise, we have the United Nations process around trying to deal with climate change. There's been a series of meetings that have been going on for now almost a third of a century, actually over a third of a century at this point, that ranged from the Kyoto Protocol to the Copenhagen Dialogue in 2010 to the Paris Accords about 7 or 8 years ago. And in each case, what happens is people from individual nation states show up not to address the problem, but to represent their own national interests in the transnational negotiations amongst themselves. the institutions are not actually designed to deal with the challenges. They're meant to deal with the competition and the struggle between nations over how to deal with it. So it's fundamentally different from also the multilateral system we have now. What we want to think of is instead that many of the problems that we have in the world related to the planetary challenges that John was outlining a moment ago are actually mostly being experienced and dealt with at a subnational level. This is kind of an interesting map that we found. This is a map of all the subnational units all over the world. It actually shows that there's a whole myriad of different kinds of systems out there for dealing with challenges at a local level. And there's a lot of reasons why people think that it's good to have a federalist system so that, you know, Californians don't exactly want to be governed the same way as Texans or Floridians or what have you. And so we have a whole bunch of subnational systems. Almost every single country in the world has a series of subnational local governance institutions that are meant to deal with the challenges that are at hand in very different ways. So you take something like climate change, for example. You know, this is affecting both Los Angeles and Miami, but it's affecting Los Angeles, which is where I'm sitting right now, John and I are sitting right now, very differently from the way it's affecting Miami. Miami has to worry about flooding. Miami has to worry about hurricanes. Here in California, we need to worry about drought. We need to worry about fires. We need to worry about air pollution. Those are the effects of climate change that are happening here locally. So it makes sense to some extent that some of these issues, particularly at the adaptation level, should be dealt with at a subnational level. And so one of the things that we propose is that there be much, much more collaboration at translocal levels between different subnational units that face similar problems. And so I'll give you an example of this. So the kinds of challenges that Los Angeles, for example, faces with respect to climate change has to do with the fact that we sit in the southwest corner of a continent. That means that we have a Mediterranean climate that's subject to intermittent droughts and subject to fires, right? So this makes it very similar to the kinds of challenges that are faced in places like Cape Town or Portugal or Perth, Australia, right? These are all places that are at the southwest corners of their continents that are facing similar kinds of problems with relation to drought. And so one of the things we propose is that there be much more networking among these subnational units to share expertise, best practices, possibly capital to deal with the challenges. By contrast, Miami should be collaborating with other places that are sitting in hurricane zones at low elevations. So places like, I don't know, Manila or Ho Chi Minh City or Bangladesh have much more in common with the kinds of challenges Miami is facing than the kinds of challenges we're facing. And we would propose that there be another network that would be dealing with those kinds of things for adapting to climate change. Now, what all of this architecture suggests is basically a de-emphasis on the nation state as the primary locus of governance. The nation state, in fact, and this is one of the things that we found really interesting about researching the book, the nation state, we think of it as this thing, that the Westphalian nation state that was kind of invented, you know, in the aftermath of the 30 Years' War in Europe. So in 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia suggested that nations should have individual sovereignty, and the sovereign should be allowed to adjudicate how things were being managed inside his borders, regardless of what sovereigns in other nation states thought. In fact, however, the nation state only became the hegemonic unit of governance, the primary unit of governance, much, much later, really only in the 1960s. If you go back to the post-war period, just after World War II, when the United Nations was being set up and people were debating world federalism, the majority of people in the world still did not live in nation states. They lived in a variety of other kinds of governance institutions. There were colonies, there were empires, there were city-states, there were condominia, there were mandates, UN mandate systems. And it was only with the coming of the post-colonial era, which really came to a head in the 1960s, which, let's remember, I mean, probably most of us on this call weren't born then, but that's not that long ago. It's actually only 60 years ago that you really had the consolidation of the nation state as the primary locus of governance and governance delivery. What we're suggesting is that made sense in the mid-20th century because the primary challenge of the mid-20th century was the challenge of economic development and state building in order to be able to provide basic services to human beings, right? And still, the primary focus, if you look at the World Bank or the IMF, and the Sustainable Development Goals that John was referencing a moment ago, these are primarily things that are meant to be developed on a one nation state basis at a time to deliver services to humans. The planetary, however, and planetary challenges are a different order of challenge altogether, and they suggest that we actually need to move a lot of governance decisions out of the nation state, out of the sovereign nation state, and either down to local institutions or up to a new category of planetary institutions. So local institutions already exist. The networks for getting them to collaborate more effectively are in the process of being built. But I think the most original thing that John and I are arguing for are really planetary institutions. And I'm going to turn it over to John to describe those.
So planetary institutions. So, well, let's think of it this way. So Nils just laid out three scales of governance, from the smallest to the largest: local institutions, national institutions, and then planetary institutions. Planetary institutions, very briefly, as we think about them, in contradistinction to, on the one hand, a world state, on the other hand, the existing multilateral system, would be very narrowly tailored, issue-specific institutions that have their jurisdiction as the planet itself, rather than lots of different nation states that come together to collaborate on issues. But they would be, like I said, issue specific and narrowly focused to avoid mission creep and becoming a world state. So you could have one for biodiversity, one for ocean plastics, one for kind of pandemic management. And we could talk maybe bit more about that in the Q&A. But what I really want to talk about more is this principle of subsidiarity, which we turn to as a mechanism or a tool for understanding how we might want to allocate authority, allocate power among those three levels that we laid out. And this is just really kind of the bare bones model. Like, I mean, we imagine, if this were to ever be really implemented, there'd be many more than three layers, but, kind of heuristically, we can think of these three: the planet itself, the national scale, and the local scale. So the principle that we came up with is, like I said, subsidiarity, which itself has a really interesting history. If any of you know it, it's best known today via its inclusion in Catholic social thought, as well as its implementation by the European Union, though, as we argue, and the EU has never really actually implemented it in a serious or meaningful way. But what subsidiarity says as a principle is that in any sort of multi-level or multi-scalar structure of governance, like the one that we're laying out, problems should be dealt with at the smallest scale at which they could be adequately dealt with. So a problem that could be dealt with at the village level should not go up to the county level to be dealt with. It should be dealt with at that small scale. And if something could be dealt with at the the neighborhood level, shouldn't be going up to the city council. If it could be dealt with by the city adequately, it shouldn't be going up to the state or the province. But on the other hand, this isn't just a call for localism. This isn't just saying the locals are the best. It's really about thinking the match between the scale of the institution and the problem itself. So some things really are best dealt with at the national level, and they should be dealt with there rather than at the local level. But the main insight that we get to in the next slide is that in the age of the planetary, as we kind of have come to understand via planetary sapience, our condition of planetarity, that there are some things that the smallest scale at which they can be dealt with is the planet itself. So things like climate change mitigation, dealing with the tolerable levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is something that can really only be decided at a planetary scale. That is the smallest scale unit that can effectively govern it. Whereas in contrast, as Nils was just saying, adaptation to climate change is really something that is better dealt with at the local level, because the local adaptation, or the adaptation challenges, are very specific to sites, specific both to their geography and topography, but also their socioeconomic conditions and political preferences and all that. So what subsidiarity gives us is a principle for going issue by issue and figuring out at which of these scales the authority should deal with that problem. So it lets us break down the problem of climate change then into both its mitigation challenges and its adaptation challenges, and look at what kind of layer should it be dealt with, and what we come to is that one, should be at the planetary scale, but the other should be at the local scale. So what this does is kind of basically break apart our contemporary modern notion of sovereignty, and that everything should, every problem should be dealt with at the national level, and the nation state then has the prerogative, if they want, to delegate some things to global governance. It can delegate some things to local governance, but ultimately they're the ones who have this kind of right of first of refusal. But instead, kind of break that model apart and end up with what we call this worldwide architecture of assistance, built from the recognition of interconnected planetarity. Next slide. And what this does essentially is, hope you enjoy this photo, allows us to both seek local flourishing by making sure that the issues that should be dealt with locally and can be dealt with locally are dealt with in the way that is that makes sense for that community, including humans as well as non-humans. Like, how do you make sure that the local ecosystems are flourishing and are working well in a way that allows all creatures, humans very much among them, to flourish? Next slide. And so the political vision that we kind of thread through our thinking of all these institutions is, some, we haven't said the word yet, technocracy. We haven't yet, but like you might have gotten a sense that a lot of these institutions, particularly planetary ones that are really focused on technical problems, we envision that there's a strong role for technical expertise. But the question then is, how do you temper that, or kind of put that in dialogue with some sort of participatory mechanism? So briefly, what we think about is, putting democratic goal setting and participatory mechanisms in, some sort of sustained dialogue with the expert execution, and that we hope would lead to effective and legitimate governance at all scales, right? Currently, we just, really only think about the national scale. That's kind of where all focus goes to. And we ignore the current abilities and kind of undercut the current abilities of local institutions, and don't even have planetary scale institutions. So final slide. So this is really, a call for not really the destruction of the nation state. Actually, we're not at all. We think there's still important roles for them to play as kind of this meso level institution that mediates, on the one hand, that mediates between the vastness of the planetary scale and the intimacy of the local scales. We actually think there are some things, particularly around economic issues, that scale is useful for. But by putting it rather at the center of things and giving it sovereignty and saying it gets to be the master of all within its boundaries, and instead placing it in as one among many scales that sit within this multi-scalar system where subsidiarity allocates authority rather than sovereignty. We can get at systems that are better able to deal with the planetary challenges that we laid out. And with that, we can open it up to questions, or whatever. Venkat, I don't know. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that in-depth discussion. Do we have any questions or comments from it's like Venkat's got a question, if you want to go ahead.
All right. Yeah, this is kind of like a exciting topic for me, and huge number of resonances with what we're doing in this program. A couple of comments and an actual question. The first comment is a set of short stories we just published from the program, Ritika Rajmohan's Dispatches from Cascadia, is basically fiction set in the future you're describing, like a future of planetarity. So I linked that in the forum discussion. But yeah, the other thought I had was, listening to your idea of like habitability as kind of like an alternative to sustainability, I kind of am now imagining a spectrum where on the one hand, sustainability, permaculture, all those things kind of are at like a artificially fetishizing a changeless state of nature, kind of like denying the fact that we live in a world that changes. So that's one extreme of the spectrum. The other extreme of the spectrum is what I think is represented by the concept of terraforming, which takes kind of like a radical push it as far as it'll go. And you see the spectrum all over the place. Like, for example, in the AI debates, one extreme is AI safety, which is kind of a world governmentish idea, and the other extreme of the spectrum is, effective accelerationism, which is kind of like a semi-ironic step on the gas, and you only live once, and life on this planet sucks. So let's actually make it as exciting as possible, even if the downside cost might be blowing the whole planet up. It strikes me that habitability is somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. So I guess my first question is that spectrum a good way to think about it? And I guess I'll ask two questions in one. The second is this idea of like entanglement, and that California has more to learn from Cape Town than from Miami. In other words, resonances across the planet matter more than like sharing the same artificial nation state boundary. That's very important, I think. And it's if you think back to the 1980s slogan of think local, act global, I came up with an alternative a few years ago, which I called think entangled, act spooky. And I think that's what California to Cape Town kind of stuff is. It's think entangled, act spooky. And I see a certain tension between that and the principle of subsidiarity. So I guess my second question is, how do you reconcile the sort of like local first primacy principle with this idea of like you should be entangled between Cape Town and California? So I guess the two are related in that you've got this spectrum of habitability in the middle idea, and then you've got this entangled plus local thing. And how do you kind of like reconcile these two tensions, I guess? So, sorry for a vague question there.
So I'll try to take that on as best I can. Venkat and John, of course, hop in too. I do think that our notion of habitability, which is really ultimately a normative notion, right? It's this idea that what we should be aiming for is not just to treat the planet as a standing reserve of resources for humans to do whatever the hell we want with. So I don't think that per se habitability is at odds with terraforming as a project. You could have a version of terraforming which is very sensitive to habitability issues, right? I mean, you can treat the world as a garden that needs to be the planet as a garden that needs to be very carefully tended. And there's also, for those of you who are into gardening, there's all sorts of different philosophies of gardening, whether you should allow them to, the species to flourish, or how much control you should have. And those are perhaps ultimately, in some sense, aesthetic issues, but they're also ethical issues about how do we think we should be engaging at this level. Speaking personally, I'm skeptical about a lot of accelerationists, whether they are pessimist accelerationists or optimist accelerationists. I just think that the metaphor I often have is, you're in a car and it's fishtailing, and your solution is not just to gently turn back against the direction you're fishtailing from, which is what is generally recommended, but actually you just hit the gas because you think you can accelerate your way out of it. Maybe that works, but as you said, Venkat, that could also lead to some pretty catastrophic outcomes. So I think one would need to be very, very careful about tempering those things. I know somebody else that you, I think, probably engaged with here, Holly Jean Buck, her book on geoengineering, I think is very balanced on this issue. The second, just to answer the second point, or address the second point about this tension between the translocal and the principle of subsidiarity, I think these are just, those two principles are operating a little bit orthogonally in our model. I don't think that they're so much in tension with one another, because the first one has to do with the allocation of decision rights, basically, within this multi-scalar system. And then once you have got your decision rights, like if you've decided that that issue X needs to be dealt with locally, like how do you deal with, buckling highways in the melting, in the melting tundra, right? that doesn't mean that you're being abandoned to yourself. There may be learnings you can have that happen across these different spaces. It doesn't mean that it has the decision rights about how to do it should be dealt with locally, but like the expertise and the technocratic resources that you might draw on, I think could happen from all over the planet. So that, you know, obviously that translocal level is happening through human mediation. That's not an anti-anthropocentric view. It's a view that humans are really good at collaborating. And by the way, this doesn't necessarily have to be government to government. It could be non-governmental organizations that are collaborating. And a lot of it could happen with technological protocols of the sort that I know many of you on this call are particularly interested in. We're mostly talking about governmental and governmentality in our book, but a lot of the things we're talking about could also be actually implemented through other kinds of protocol layers.
Great, thank you. Tim, question?
Yes, thanks. This is a really, really good presentation. I guess my question is around just like conflicts between larger and smaller bodies, and where if you look, like I posted a reply on the forum, but like take like housing, for example, right? You can imagine it's a very local issue. A lot of the constraints around like the actual houses and buildings are very local, but a lot of times in practice it gets bottlenecked by things like national environmental requirements, right? And I feel like the generalized version of this problem is for anything you value, like, you know, you'll have like these higher level authorities, and they can like restrict degrees of freedoms that are most valuable for like local projects, right? Effectively saying, you know, like, yes, you can manage your own local thing, but actually we have this overriding concern. So how do you think about that? Like where, like, I guess my question would be, can you actually have these two things coexist? Like, or are the smaller decision units always going to end up like neutered by just higher level constraints?
So that's a really good question. I mean, first of all, I mean, I think acknowledging that there will like always be conflict, both among the scales, but also even with among units at the same scale. So there'll be like horizontal and vertical conflict is like part of the system, and we kind of map out. We have an idea for what we call a subsidiary assembly, which would be some sort of institution that sits outside of the structure to adjudicate these sort of disputes. So like, I mean, there's something we've thought about. It's a difficult answer, right? There will always, you know, conflict will always be there, and one of the reasons why we think the system needs to be politicized. Now, housing, I actually think is a really good example, or a really important example. Though I actually have a completely opposite read on you. So I think housing is primarily blocked at the local level, and this is and this is actually the problem. Housing is a good example of the failure of subsidiarity, because housing, the authority of how much housing you can build is basically, at least in California, I'll only speak for California, where you know, is given to the local level. It's given to each city council essentially, and city councils are basically really basically captured by NIMBY interests. And as a result, even though we can know, so in LA County, for example, which is made up of 70 distinct municipalities, we know that the broader region needs a ton more housing. But then, and you know, like, so we all know we need it, but like, you know, the city of LA doesn't want to do it. City of Beverly Hills doesn't want to do it. City of Inglewood doesn't want, like, so because they all have like, you know, homeowner, you know, interests or you know, that don't want to like push down property values, but you know, blah, blah, blah. So now what we have is the problem. It's been pushed too low. It really needs to be dealt with at a much higher level, because housing, it doesn't really matter the distinct individual city boundaries for the housing issue, which is really regional. Needs to be at a much larger scale. So in California, right, there actually has been movement at the state level to force down smaller scales to do it. So this would be kind of an example of subsidiary somewhat working. Like, we tried at the local level, it's led to like a complete disaster where there's like a vast undersupply of housing, and now the issue is moving up to a larger scale. In this case, so anyway, so this is like, I mean, something to say on the one hand. This is an example, or the housing is an example where, on the one hand, the scale at which it has been governed has failed, and there is maybe somewhat of a correction happening by changing the scale at which it is being governed. Anyway, that's
but I think the one thing you said that was quite interesting to me is the idea of like if it fails at the local level, you sort of move it up. I think like this is maybe a way for this to be, for the conflict resolution to feel more legitimate to people. Like, we tried and we failed, therefore we passed the buck to you. It's better than like, you know, you guys get your little sandbox that we've defined for you and you get to play within these constraints. So yeah, that's an interesting way to think about it.
One more thing that I would say is that to your broader question, that like, wouldn't higher scales always just be dictating down to lower scales? This is one of the reasons why I've been talking about scales rather than levels. And this is not something we really mentioned before, but the way we think about scales is about really about size. That's where we're saying like smaller and larger rather than like higher and lower.
Right.
Levels imply a hierarchy, right? In levels, currently we live in a world of levels where the nation state is the highest level, and it like over, you know, supersedes the state level, the county level, the city level, etc. But if you were to like totally reimagine, and then this takes kind of like obviously a big leap of imagination, where all of these scales are not really thought of hierarchically, but more or less equals that just happen to govern larger or smaller territories, and that doesn't make them subservient to the bigger ones. They all are understood as having their pros and cons and their sets of benefits. Anyway, that's that. So that's.
I think we should let. I'm going to mispronounce your name. Chinoe.
Yes.
Sorry.
Please, thank you.
Timber.
Okay, I'm curious to hear more about the metaphor of planetary sapience, including if that favors certain kinds of biological decision-making and organization over others, but also in general.
Yeah, let me talk about that. So just first of all, a footnote here or a hat tip. One of our colleagues who may have spoken or may be speaking at this in the Summer of Protocols series here is Benjamin Bratton, who's some of you probably know him. He's a philosopher of technology. He's based at UC San Diego. He runs a program here at the Berggruen Institute called the Antikythera program, which researches the philosophical implications of planetary scale computation. And this is really his term that we picked up in the book. And what he means by that is planetary sapience as opposed to planetary sentience. So, you know, we can have a debate about panpsychism, and there's a whole philosophical literature about that. He's referring to a very specific thing with planetary sapience, which is the knowledge of the planet that is created by the technostructure itself, right? So, for example, the hockey stick projection that we have for climate change is an artifact that has emerged out of weather satellites that were initially put up. So initially we put into place a whole series of sensor networks to deal with weather forecasting, which then over time has been repurposed. The data has been repurposed to be able to create trend lines and then projections as to what's going to happen with climate in the future. Likewise, we discovered in the 1960s the architecture of plate tectonics on the planet because a whole series of sensor networks were put into place all over the planet to detect nuclear detonations. And once we put into place all those those sensor networks to detect, you know, the shakes from nuclear detonations, we began to realize the patterns of earthquakes all over the world, the Ring of Fire around the Pacific, and so on. And we started to understand the mechanics of plate tectonics to a much greater extent. So the technologies that maybe are produced for one purpose initially actually create a greater understanding of planetary processes over time. And so one of the things we say all of the different planetary institutions that we propose in the book should be doing is they should be investing in enhancing planetary sapience. But to answer your question directly, obviously this does privilege a certain kind of technoscientific knowledge over other kinds of knowledges of the planet. But I think that one of the things we talk about is many of the insights that are coming out of Earth system science and systems biology that add up to this condition of what we describe as the condition of planetarity actually are sort of a rediscovery of ideas that have been very present in indigenous knowledge systems from time immemorial, right? I mean, many of the ideas of holism and integration and a need to live in balance and harmony with various systems that we're deeply intertwined with, these are old ideas that have been around for a long time in other kinds of knowledge traditions outside the technoscientific one that comes out of Western science.
That's interesting. Thank you.
Timber?
Yeah, thanks for the talk. Really, really interesting. One thing I think about a lot, my family has worked in tree farming for a long time, so we've tossed around the quote about society grows great when old men plant trees that they know they'll never sit under. And this really seems to be along those lines. But I'm curious about what you guys have found as some of the more useful ways of communicating the importance of long-termism or getting people to value actions that are going to result in benefits that they'll never witness.
I don't know if we really have an answer to that yet. The book doesn't even come out. Actually, the book comes out in a month from 2 to 3 days from now. So this is really our first book talk. So we don't yet. So thank you all for the opportunity. So I don't really, we don't have like tried and true tested ways that we've rolled out yet. I don't know. I mean, Nils, what you any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, what I would say about it is, I think I would like to believe, maybe I'm wrong, that a greater appreciation for our, deep entanglement with all these different systems and the fact that there is no planet B. Some people on this call might disagree with that, but in our view, or at least the vast majority of us are not ever going to get to planet B, right? And that we better take care of planet A as best we can, would at least, and understanding in a more technically specified way that comes out of Earth system science and systems biology, the nature of that deep entanglement I would hope, encourage people to think about the fact that we have to make long-term plans. We shouldn't just, run our global economy as a smash and grab operation, which is largely the way it's been doing since the advent of industrialism. I don't know if that will actually work. I really like your family's phrase about growing trees that or growing stuff that you're never going to harvest. Humans used to be actually better at this, right? I mean, I was in New York City a couple weeks ago, up on the Upper West Side, and I saw, is it St. John the Divine? Is that the name of the church across the street from Columbia? That's still being built. I mean, they started building it a century ago. And you look at many of the great cathedrals and the great religious edifices all over the world, these are things that took hundreds of years to build, right? I mean, some monumental architecture gets built really quickly. I think pyramids were built, obviously in time for, the pharaohs to be buried inside of them. But a lot of things take a long time. When you think about irrigation systems that are developed by communities that last, for hundreds of years in many cases. We actually used to be better at this than we are now. And, we can have a whole discussion about where we lost our way on that. And the we is not everybody. The we is some of us, not all of us. But I think that this kind of way of framing the way we sit on the planet might be one way back towards more long-termist thinking.
Thanks.
I think there's one more question in the chat from Jenna, if you have time, guys. Jenna, if you're online, do you want to?
Oh.
I can read it out for her.
Yeah. Let me read it out loud for the people who are recorded. Slide 25 was the big finish with respect to governance I was looking forward to, and of course contains multitudes. That slide would be the one on the end of the sovereign nation state, not the end of the nation state, the end of sovereignty. And you wanted to, and then you say, can we talk about how this might look in a specific case, such as Louisiana's Cancer Alley, where many of the communities deeply affected by actions of multinational corporations? Well, that's, I think, a really good example for us, right, of the way in which the local communities have not been allowed to make decisions about the local environmental insults that are happening as a result of these multinational corporations. Those decisions are being made at the national level in terms of the regulatory systems. Now, the EPA has, look, Louisiana in particular is a There's some corruption issues there, and that's another topic that we don't deal with in our book. That there's always going to be failures of governance at every level. One reason why you don't want to have a world state, in our opinion, is that it creates a potential single point of failure. Having a multiplicity and a plural set of institutions means more anti-fragility in the entire system. But for sure, we would look at the things like, and there's places like this all over the country. The Salton Sea in inland California would be another example of a place that was completely abused locally by outside forces because they didn't have to respect the voices of local constituencies at all. And so I think that would be an example. The Louisiana example would be very much one where the allocation of decision rights didn't happen properly. Leaving aside the issue about corrupt elites locally in Louisiana, perhaps inviting this stuff in.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time, you guys, today. Any last minute questions or comments? I know we're already around 10 minutes over.
Well, let me just say, first of all, thank you very much, Venkat and the whole Summer Protocols community for allowing us to dry run this thing with you guys. If there's any follow-up engagements any of you want, please reach out to us. Our emails are easily available. I'm sure Venkat would be happy to share them with you. We're also eager to get critical feedback. So if you think this is wrong-headed and stupid, some of the stuff we're saying, please let us know that as well. Because really, ultimately, the purpose of this book is not to provide definitive answers, but to frame a problem that needs solutions and to at least provide some tentative possibilities of what those solutions could look like, to start a debate. Because these planetary scale problems are not going away, and we desperately need to come up with new systems to address them. So thank you, everybody.
I mean, one last thing, which is I'd be very curious if any of you, just based on the talk or end up reading the book, what the protocol version of this looks like. What kind of mapping your expertise onto what we've laid out, because I think there's a lot of ways that could actually help us think through a lot of these questions, because we're now taking this book and trying to think a lot of the book is an overview of these arguments, but there's a lot more to be done in thinking about, like, well, what would exactly mean to set up a planetary institution that deals with climate change or biodiversity, and I think protocol thinking could be really helpful for us also to think about how this could move forward and get implemented. So look forward to hopefully this just being the first conversation.
Thank you very much, and all the best with the book. Hopefully it does really well and starts these conversations.
Excellent. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thanks you.
All right. We'll see you all next week for